whenever I was getting ready to preach in this passage, I decided I was going to look something up on Wikipedia. What I looked up was the article on theobroma oil. Now, theobroma oil, if you're not familiar with it, it is described in the first paragraph as a pale yellow fat. And Wikipedia lists a number of uses for it. Those include toiletries and pharmaceuticals. Let's just say I looked up what it was used for in pharmaceuticals, and you maybe just don't want to know this morning. The article gave the chemical composition of theobroma oil. It's made up of stearic acid, palmitic acid, myristic acid, and a whole load of other acids that I'm not going to tell you about because I don't know how you pronounce them. The article had pictures as well. There was this very anemic looking yellow block, and there was a horrible gelatinous bit of pulp that had been removed as part of the processing. It's a bit of a horrible article. And yet, believe it or not, the main use of theobroma oil is not toiletries and it's not pharmaceuticals, it's food. It's very much a case of if you know, you know. Whenever you put a square of Cadbury dairy milk on your tongue and you feel it melting in your mouth, or whenever you bite into a gooey, fudgy brownie, or whenever you have a rich, velvety spoonful of chocolate mousse, the most important ingredient is theobroma oil. Now, you maybe didn't know that. And the reason you maybe didn't know that is it has another name. And its other name is a lot more appetizing. It's also known as cocoa butter. And it's interesting, I think there's just this real dissonance going on, isn't there? You imagine if you were to step into one of the factories where the cocoa beans are processed into cocoa butter, I imagine you'd be pretty grossed out. You'd maybe see the pulp, and you'd maybe see those pallid yellow blocks, and you'd maybe smell the smells, and your stomach perhaps would turn. But if you were able to see the end result of the process, a warm, frothy cup of hot chocolate on a cold winter's day, or a moist, molten slice of chocolate lava cake, your stomach wouldn't be turning, your mouth would be watering. And what that teaches us is that sometimes we need to look beyond the process and we need to see the finished product. And we've got something a bit like that at the end of Isaiah chapter 52. So last week we looked at verse 14. Verse 14 is a horrible verse. It's really grim, isn't it? It's horrific. Just as there were many who were appalled at you, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form marred beyond human likeness. Absolutely horrific. Here is God's servant, and he has been smashed and beaten into a bloody pulp. And people look at him, in fact, they only take one look at him, and they gasp, and they turn their heads away. They cannot bear to look at him. It is a horrible, disgusting, hideous sight. And yet, verse 14 is the process. Verse 14 is like the view from inside the factory. Verse 15 is the end result. And it's brilliant. Now, over the next few weeks, we'll be seeing how all of this works. We're not going to see that this morning. This song is very mysterious, and God takes his time in gradually unfolding some of the details. So we're not going to see the details this morning. But for now, what I do want us to see is 3 results of what the servant goes through in verse 14. So 3 results, and we see all of them in verse 15. And the first result is that the nations get sprinkled. The nations get sprinkled. We see that in verse 15. So will he sprinkle many nations. One of the things that really struck me in preparing to preach in this verse is how every single word in that first line is really packed full of significance. So will he sprinkle many nations. What's that all about? Maybe you were wondering as you memorized the verse, what's this all about? This sprinkling. Well, it's steeped in the language of the Old Testament. And especially it's steeped in the language of priests and sacrifice. And actually, I was searching for how many times the word appears in the Old Testament this week, and it's quite surprising just how often we read about something being sprinkled. And I'm going to give you a few examples. So for example, whenever the very first priests were consecrated, so that is Aaron and his sons, they were gathered together, a bull was brought, the bull was slaughtered, the blood of the bull was taken, and it was sprinkled onto these new priests. And that was a sign that they have been set apart for a very special job. Or another example, in Leviticus we read about provisions being made for whenever people sin accidentally, or at least unintentionally. And you can imagine a situation where maybe people are starting to get a bit sloppy about obedience and they end up falling into sin. Well, what's the solution? Well, the solution is you take another bull and you sacrifice it and you sprinkle the blood and the sin is atoned for. There was hope as well whenever someone sinned, not just accidentally, but deliberately. There's hope of forgiveness because someone who had sinned deliberately could bring a lamb. And the lamb would be slaughtered and the blood would be sprinkled and they would be forgiven. And actually, if you were too poor to afford a lamb, you could bring 2 turtle doves and they would be slaughtered and their blood would be sprinkled and you would be forgiven. If someone had leprosy and he got better, well, he'd be sprinkled with blood. And after he was sprinkled with blood, he'd be declared clean. And the very fact that he has been sprinkled would allow him to go home. It would allow him to start living his life again. The sprinkling would change everything. And then, the biggest example of all, the Day of Atonement. The single biggest day in the calendar in ancient Israel. And on that day, atonement would be made for the sins of the whole nation. And again, blood would be sprinkled and atonement would be declared. So lots of sprinkling in the Old Testament. But I realize for some of you, you're maybe sitting there and you're thinking, what on earth? This just sounds like something from a completely different planet. Maybe actually some of you've tried reading through the Bible and you've reached the book of Leviticus and it's exactly this sort of stuff that's made you think, what is going on? How does anybody manage to read this? So, what's the point of all the sprinkling? Well, surely, is part of the reason for the sprinkling, and we find it very perplexing, but is part of the reason for the sprinkling not that God, hundreds of years before Isaiah, was getting things ready for his servant? What was God doing? He was crafting and he was shaping a series of pictures and illustrations and a series of words and a way of speaking so that the work of the servant could be more clearly understood. Behold my servant. And God is saying here in this first line of verse 15, my servant is the very one who the temple and the sacrifices and the blood and the sprinkling has been pointing to. And so in verse 15, we see that the servant God sends has got a priestly role. He's the one who sprinkles the people. He's the one who deals with their sin and guilt. He's the one who consecrates them and makes them holy. And as we're going to see over the next few weeks, and as we got a hint off in verse 14, he doesn't do it by sprinkling the blood of bulls. He does it with his own blood. So this servant sprinkles. But who does he sprinkle? Well, again, there's no wasted words here. So will he sprinkle many nations. And that's the most astounding thing about this line. Because the Jews reading this whenever it was first written, they were well used to the idea of blood being sprinkled in the Old Testament. But the thing is, whenever blood was sprinkled in the Old Testament, it was always for the cleansing of the Israelites. At the Day of Atonement was for the cleansing of the nation, but it was the nation. It was singular. But this servant, he goes beyond the nation and he sprinkles many nations. And so we see here that the work of Jesus is going to go so much further than what people in the Old Testament were used to. Not further than God said he would go. I mean, we sing quite often in the Psalms, including this morning, about the nations, but further than most people realized. He will sprinkle many nations. And there's something shocking about this. Because for so many Jews in Isaiah's day, the nations were filthy. We're the chosen people. We are the set apart people. They're the Gentiles. And yet this servant is going to cut through ethnic boundaries. He's going to cut through national boundaries. And he's going to sprinkle many nations. Romans and Greeks, Irish and English, Nigerians and Romanians and Lithuanians. And he's going to cleanse and consecrate the most surprising people imaginable. There will be people who have grown up not knowing the first thing about the one true God. And the servant's going to sprinkle them. There will be people who have given their earliest years, maybe even their best years, to the worship of idols. And the servant is going to sprinkle them. And so as we read of this servant sprinkling the nations, we should be thankful, shouldn't we? Because that's the only reason that we have been made clean. He has sprinkled us in spite of the fact that we are Gentiles. He has sprinkled us in spite of the fact that by nature we are strangers and foreigners to God. He has sprinkled us in spite of the years that we have given to idolatry. And we should be so thankful that he's made us clean. But as well as being thankful, we should be hopeful, shouldn't we? We think about the town around us. We think about the thousands and thousands of people who need to be made clean. Well, this cleansing work of the servant includes the most surprising people imaginable. And so we can be hopeful as we think about our mission. So the first thing we see, the nations get sprinkled. Second thing we see, mouths get shut. Mouths get shut. And specifically, but not only, kings' mouths. So will he sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. The thing about kings is they don't tend to be used to keeping their mouths shut. Just this last week, I was listening to a podcast about Napoleon. He wasn't a king, but he was an emperor. And it mentioned these meetings that he would have with his chief officials and his generals. And These meetings, they would go on and on for hours and hours. They would go way, way on into the wee hours of the morning. But they weren't really meetings. At least they weren't meetings in the way that we think of meetings. They were monologues. And Napoleon would speak and everybody would listen. And he would go on and on about the great triumphs that he has won in the past. And he'd go on and on about the exact strategy that needs to be followed to get victory in the present. And these poor generals, I imagine them yawning and trying to stay awake, but they have no choice but to sit there and listen as Napoleon talks and talks and talks. They don't get to speak, they have to listen. That's quite often the case with kings, isn't it? They tend to surround themselves with yes men. They surround themselves with people who just smile and nod at everything they say. I'm sure you've seen pictures of Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Something laughable, really laughable about the pictures. It's absolutely ludicrous. Do you ever see the pictures and he's maybe visiting a factory and there's a crowd of senior officials gathered around him? You know, there's generals and all sorts of very important people. Do you ever notice what they have in their hands? You can hardly miss it in the photos. What do they have in their hands? Notebooks and pens. Because they have to jot down every single word that comes out of their leader's mouth. He's used to talking, and he's not used to stopping. And we could widen this verse out. It's not just kings. It's designed surely to make us think of all sorts of people in all sorts of high places. Political leaders, Silicon Valley executives, judges, radio presenters, people with influence and authority who are used to getting exactly what they want. And yet, they're gonna be left speechless. Something is going to be revealed to them that is going to leave them completely lost for words. What is it? Well, we'll find out more in weeks to come. What we do see here is it's something to do with the servant. Kings will shut their mouths because of him. The works that he does is going to completely take their breath away. And here we are this morning, 2,700 years after the book of Isaiah was written, and we can see, can't we, some of the ways that this has come to pass. I was thinking just this week about Pontius Pilate. He wasn't a king, but he was a governor. He was a very, very important man. He was a ruler. And do you remember Pontius Pilate? He put Jesus on trial. You can read about it in Mark's Gospel. And Jesus didn't play along with the game. And we read that Pilate was amazed. And then the story stops. And it's almost as if, and maybe it is actually what happened, the question stopped. Pilate's amazed, he is left dumbfounded, and his mouth is shut. All because, what's he doing? He's looking at the servant. 300 years after Pontius Pilate, not just a governor, but the emperor of Rome itself had his mouth shut. The Emperor Constantine, the most powerful man in the whole world, was left dumbfounded by Jesus. And he pledged his allegiance and he pledged his entire empire to Christ. And there's all sorts of stories down through history of kings who have suddenly been stopped in their tracks and they bowed down before this servant. There's stories of business magnates and sports stars who have given everything up for the sake of Jesus Christ. Kings will shut their mouths because of him. But this morning, we don't just look back, we look forward. And we think of all those powerful, influential people who stand so arrogantly against the Lord Jesus. We think of politicians who promote scandalous laws. We think of journalists who fill the airwaves with anti-Christian narratives. We think of tyrants who rule in other countries and persecute the people of Christ. We think of eloquent men who have vast crowds hanging on their every word. We think of men who simply have to speak, and whatever it is that they want, it's done. Well, the day is going to come when the servant is going to come a second time. And those kings and those rulers and those powerful men are going to have nothing to say. They'll have no excuses. They won't be able to weasel their way out of it. They won't be able to offer justifications or extenuating circumstances. Their mouths will be shut. They will be ashamed. They will be frightened. And you'll be able to hear a pin drop. Kings will shut their mouths because of him. So we've seen two things. Nations get sprinkled, mouths get shut. Thirdly, the gospel gets spread. The gospel gets spread. We're to the second half of the verse now. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. Something's going to dawn on these kings, and by extension, something is going to dawn on a lot of their subjects. They are finally going to get it. What is it they're going to get? Well, again, I don't want to tell you just yet what it is they're going to understand. Things are going to unfold slowly as we go through the song, but there are two things that I want to say this morning. First one, Paul quotes this line in Romans chapter 15, and he ties it, doesn't he, to the spread of the gospel. Not just the spread of the gospel in places where there already are churches, but the spread of the gospel in places where it's never been heard before. And again, that gives us hope, doesn't it? Our country and our county, full of people who've never been told and they've never seen. And we long for the light to dawn on them, and yet we can feel so pessimistic sometimes, can't we? So thick is the darkness. Well, here's a warrant for hope. So we think of people who, as of this moment in time, don't know the first thing about Jesus. As we think about people who only ever hear the name of Jesus when it's used as a swear word. God tells us here the truth of his servant Jesus will dawn. That's the first thing. Second thing I want you to notice, it's a really important word. We haven't mentioned it so far. Do you notice how the verse begins? So will he sprinkle many nations. Do you see the word? So will he sprinkle. Some of us have got a real tendency of starting sentences with the word so, don't we? So I was talking to your man down the street earlier on. I've actually had to catch myself 3 or 4 times just this morning because I knew I was going to say this. I've been close to starting sentences with so. We use the word so quite often as a filler word. That's not how it's used here. It is an incredibly important word in this verse because what it's doing is it is taking everything that we've seen this morning, the blessing and the forgiveness of the nations, the silencing of the proud and arrogant kings, the spread of the gospel to people and homes where the gospel has never been heard or understood before. It's taking all of those things, and what's it doing? It's linking it to what has come before. What's come before? Well, verse 14 has come before. The agony and the humiliation of the servant, his disfigurement and his suffering. And it is showing us you cannot have verse 15 unless you have verse 14. You cannot have the glory of the spreading of the gospel unless you have the anguish of the Lord Jesus on the cross. So will he sprinkle many nations. Whenever you go home this afternoon and you tuck into a nice chocolatey dessert after lunch, I'll understand if you want to forget all about the Wikipedia article I told you about. I'll understand if you don't want to think about the different acids and fats and yellowish blocks that go into it. That's fair enough. But as we think about the hope that we have, because the gospel has dawned on us, we can never forget the process. We can never forget what it cost. And so we delight in the fact that what we hadn't been told, we've seen. We delight in the fact that what we hadn't heard, we've understood. We delight in the fact that we have been sprinkled and cleansed and set apart. We delight in the fact that kings will shut their mouths because of him. But we marvel at the disfigurement and the humiliation that made that happen. See the servant. See his gruesome suffering. And see what he has accomplished by that suffering. So will he sprinkle many nations, and kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand.